like completely replacing one library with another one, or one vendor with another, or whatever the goal might
That's a
be.
major lift. That's non-trivial.
That's right. Yeah, that's the task ahead of us.
So that's a big task. That's what you did at Netflix.
That's right.
Was it but was it fully automated, or was there a lot of Welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. This is Darren Pulsford, Chief Solution Architect, author, and most importantly, your host. On today's episode, Embracing Technical Debt, with special guest Jonathan Schneider, CEO of Moderene. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Darren. Good to be here.
Hey, we had a brief conversation last week or a couple of weeks ago, and it was really interesting. I really enjoyed our conversation. So I said, we have to have Jonathan come on the show. But before we talk about passionate things like AI and software engineering, two of my big passions, Jonathan, let's hear a little bit about your background. Because hey, people like everyone's superhero backstory, so we need your superhero backstory.
Yeah, I think it's more like a super weird backstory. Went to school on violin performance scholarship, but when the Iraq War started, I enlisted in the Army, so I spent about 12 years altogether. Eventually, as an Army officer, running primarily gun
Wait.
trucks.
No, wait, you got to back up just a second. You were in college on a violin performance?
That's right. Yeah, violin performance scholarship was how it started.
That is awesome. I love classical instruments. I've
That's
got two violinists and two cellists in my family.
oh,
Um,
that's you have
so
a
yeah, no,
whole
that
ensemble
oh
just
yeah,
right
yeah.
there in
We
your
have a lot
home.
of fun when we're all together.
That's great.
So and then you just up and enlisted?
Well, yeah, we when the Iraq War started, I think a lot of people around me were as well in that time. So wound up in as an Army transportation officer doing gun trucks for convoy escort primarily for heavy equipment transporters up and down the road. Uh, at the end of all of that, when I came out of all of that, back to software engineering at a small insurance company, and then somehow I got recruited by Netflix. Went to Netflix and worked on engineering tools there for a little while, and that's where the foundational technology behind mass automated refactoring started. I started a project called Open Rewrite there some years ago.
What an incredible backstory. That's not weird. That's incredible backstory.
It's a lot of variety. I've lived
A
like
lot of
three or
right.
four
Well,
lives
first
in
off,
one.
thank you for your service.
Of
I
course.
appreciate that a lot. But what an incredible backstory. Violinist turned soldier turned software geek like me,
That's
right? A
right.
software engineer. That's awesome.
That's right.
That's awesome. So the project that you did at Netflix was refactoring massive amounts of code. Is that how that's where your passion really came about?
I felt like it got pulled out of me there because at the time Netflix was one of the famous microservices, many
Oh yeah, they're
repository
very well known
cultures.
for that.
They were known for this original culture deck called freedom and responsibility, which meant that central teams, whether that be security or engineering tools, couldn't impose constraints on what product engineers did. Really, you couldn't say, hey, I need you to move forward to the latest version of X or Y, and by a certain date, if you don't do it, I'm going to break your build. So we did spend a lot of effort on reporting, trying to surface information to developers about where they're at and where we want them to be and the difference between those two things. And it just resulted in essentially no action because we couldn't force it. So as I would go around talking to engineers and say, what could I do to help you understand you need to move forward? They say, well, do the work for me. Otherwise,
Of
I've got
course,
something
that's
else
a
to do.
typical
That's the
engineer.
sarcastic response, right? But they were under a lot of feature pressure, and so it made sense. And I think if you hear that enough, and you cannot force change on them, it kind of results in this. Okay, well, we need to adopt the servant mentality. Then, how do we make the change for them? and therefore this kind of automatic refactoring at massive scale was born.
So when you'd say, hey, they'd have to upgrade, we're talking about upgrading to libraries or
It was
techniques or operating systems. What did they need to upgrade?
That's a really good question. I think it's a bunch of different pillars of use cases. I mean, the one that really kicked it off for us was we had an internal library called Blitz for J, which was like log4j or SL4j, but it's just internally written. And then at some point we decided, why did we write our own thing? We should just use one of the open things. So they
Which
deprecated
turned
it.
out
Of
to not be a
course,
great thing after all.
years later, there were still 5 million references to this thing, so what Netflix engineer is going to come into work one day and think the best use of my time today is just replacing logging statements one for another? So it just was not getting done.
Right.
But so that was a use case. There was security vulnerability repair. Obviously, I've got a particular class of vulnerability. I'm trying to remove it.
So we're
There
not
could
just
be,
talking replacing a library or an API, a small API change
right.
that that might be deprecated in 6 years from now. We're
That's
talking
right.
real
Real
code
code
changes.
change.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah. We,
so
we call this in
what an
general maybe like tech stack liquidity, the idea of moving from X to Y. And that could be moving from one version of a thing to the next version of it, or it could mean like completely replacing one library with another one, or one vendor with another, or whatever the goal might
that's a
be.
major lift. That's non-trivial.
That's right. Yeah, that's the task ahead of us.
So that's a big task. That's what you did at Netflix.
That's right.
Was it but was it fully automated, or was there a lot of, first I'll identify it all, and then second I'll have to see what I can do 80% automated, and then the 20% fall out? I mean, how did you manage all this? Because
I actually really like the way you just phrased that. So first of all, identifying. I think that is the pattern. Is first of all, you need a data source about the code that you can do that impact analysis to identify how spread the problem really is, and where its concentrations, hotspots are, and which parts of it are worth automating, because they have, if there's going to be two occurrences of something, just go fix it. If there's going to be 20,000, potentially it's worth
yeah, I'm glad you
doing.
said that, because I've made that mistake myself, where I've gone out and I fully automated something and there were only two instances to convert the
Right.
code.
We're engineers, we
I
like to
got
do that.
150 lines of script,
Yep,
and
that's right. That's
it
right.
would have taken me 5 minutes to do that. It took me
That's
two
right.
hours to run it through.
When we ask like how automated is it really, um, ultimately the change production, the like, here I've prepared the change for you with this program is automated. The acceptance of that is still a product team by product team thing. Ultimately this is going into their code base. We did not find that bots were very effective. So think of like a Dependabot or Renovate, those kinds of things where
Right.
you've got like an independent party, making decisions. Rather, we want to put kind of a tool in a developer's hands that they're just acting more efficiently, and they wind up being the primary author on that commit. That's so a lot of the experiences we developed there and we've done since have been around enabling
So
developers to take multi-repository action using their
So
own
that's
name.
interesting, because most, especially executives, right? They would think, "Oh, just put a bot there; it'll solve the
Right,
problem."
right.
But you found that was that's counterintuitive. That it's better to give a tool to an engineer that augments, or what's the right word?
It is. It's kind of like making them a cyborg, right? Like they just
Yeah,
have
I
this
was
like
thinking the
now
same thing.
superpower, right? That
Yeah,
they
they're
didn't have
superpowered to
before.
now see, and it helps them make those changes, and they can say
Right.
yes or no, or they
That's
can
right.
say everything in this grouping, everything that looks like this, go ahead and do it this
That's
way.
right.
But
That's
it's
right.
still left up to the software engineer.
That's right. It's still their name on it in the end. There's a question of timing. When is it right to accept a change? I don't know. I have a big feature emergency right now. maybe come back to me in 2 or 3 days. When automation produces a change, then it's able to produce it on whatever the latest head or tip of the branch really is right now. So it makes it a bit easier to, when you've got a moment of downtime, take this change and push it through. For
I really
PRs, I
like
think
that
there's been
concept.
a lot of assumption, I think, that mass PRs are the way to distribute change at scale. And I think of PRs now, like, especially when they come from an external team, is almost like unwelcome advice from an in-law or something like that. Or you're like aunt, you're like, and what do you do with that kind of advice? Your human nature is to like want to find something wrong with it and reject it. And that's what developers do. They'll pick on some minor detail of an externally issued PR and say, close it. Because, I wasn't asking for that right now. So if instead you develop experiences where the developer is the agent of change, then they're less likely to reject it.
This is interesting you put this because this really fits well into like a generative AI philosophy as well. Instead of having Gen AI just control everything,
You need to have human
use
in the
it as
loop.
an augmentation to a software engineer and
Yeah,
say, hey, here's
right.
some suggestions. Which one would you like?
That's right.
Or because I know when I program with Gen AIs, I don't take the code that they generate.
No, I mean, very
Never.
rarely. Yeah, like
I look at it and go, oh, that's the API,
it's
and
sort of
that's
close.
how you do that technique. That's interesting. And then I write my own
That's right.
code. Maybe I enjoy typing. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a faster Stack Overflow. It's giving you,
Yes, it's a faster Stack Overflow.
yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
used to take me hours to go through Stack Overflow and find
right,
and combine things together. Now I can get it in one thing, and it's right about 80% right.
right.
You know, every time it's never 100% right.
That's right.
Um, so this is similar to that sort of
It
thing,
is in the
right? I
sense that
still
you do want to put a human, stamp on it sooner or later. Yeah, yeah.
Well, and also I like how you said there's a psychology to this as well
There is.
for the developers,
Yeah, it's as
right?
much a
If
social
you,
engineering problem as it is a technical one. Yeah,
yeah, I love that. I love
yeah.
that because that's going to be important moving forward. All right, so how big is this problem? Is my next comment, right? And
So
Netflix, it was a problem, right?
it
I mean,
was.
obviously, they formed a team to do it, but in the industry as a whole,
Yeah.
why even refactor? What's the purpose? Why?
Just to think of as, I don't know if I really appreciated how big of a problem it was in industry at that time when I was there at Netflix. But I went on from Netflix to, I worked on the Spring team at Pivotal. So Spring being one of the most common Java frameworks to develop enterprise applications. Founded a project called Micrometer for metrics instrumentation. And along with my co-founder Olga Kunzic at Pivotal, we were introducing a product called Spinnaker, which was a Netflix open source continuous delivery
Of
product
course, I know
into
Spinnaker.
enterprise.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, it seems unrelated, but we were adding that to Pivotal's product portfolio and working with some early adopters of that. A major bank, a major retailer in the U.S., and as we were, you know, adding this continuous delivery capability, what we kept hearing was, oh yeah, I'd love to do automated canary analysis or whatever advanced continuous delivery topic, but talk to me in a year when I'm done moving Spring Boot 1 to 2, right? Because at that time, I was thinking of this one particular bank had about 8,000 applications written on top of Spring Boot. So every time the Spring team decided, you get one of the Spring team members go off on some like spiritual retreat and decide that functional programming is the way of the world and change a bunch of APIs, like, great. As the consumer of this, I have to change now 8,000 applications. And it just was really, really dragging them down. They were spending 30 or 40% of their time on that. And I think, beyond that, we were seeing like, well, the problem was the same at a lot of different places. And because software development is largely industrialized, we pull stuff off the shelf, third party and open source stuff, even though we're all different organizations, we're basically building on the same substrate of third party and open source stuff.
Right.
So a break and change one place affects, a bunch of different organizations. And so we started thinking, the thing of greater value here is actually this ability to move, transform software. And so we left Pivotal VMware and started doing this independently.
So it's really interesting because there's a couple reasons why. One is the software that you're using has changed.
That's right.
And there are some absolutely notorious
Absolutely.
Spring Beam, where they change the API completely and you're completely hosed, right?
Yeah.
But there's also technical debt if I don't change the APIs,
Yeah.
right? If I just keep adding more onto it that builds up over time.
Yeah.
So, and then there's security is another big issue. For example, the Log4j fiasco.
Yes.
Right? That was a huge one. How do I protect myself against Log4j, especially if I'm using a third-party library that no one's maintaining anymore?
Right.
So there's some real substantial things we're talking about here.
Right.
And you're the only ones that have really come up with a solution for this. Everyone else is doing it by hand.
Well, I'd say it's surprisingly difficult. It's definitely a necessary solution, but if you're going to make change, I think one of the problems with that was apparent at the beginning at Netflix was that the same freedom and responsibility culture, which meant we couldn't impose a constraint, also guaranteed that there was no stylistic consistency inside the organization. I mean,
right, yeah,
you could have tabs and spaces being an obvious example, but like it goes beyond that to their import ordering format. They're just like the way their code looks is different from one place to another, and so the refactoring
and
technology
you can
needs
come
to
in with an
look.
automated tool to prettify all their code to a standard, right? Because this is what I hate about software engineers, and I am one.
They will never.
They want to be creative. I'm like, you want to be creative on where you're putting the curly bracket. Really?
That's right.
Do you really care? Right. Does that really matter that much? And they will argue. They will argue tooth and nail.
Yeah, you will die on that hill. You will never get them to agree. Yeah, it's
exactly.
Well, but actually, interestingly, like there were, I think of the other organizations that were building early refactoring automation. Google had worked on something called Refaster and Error Prone. Now, Google is very top down in their style. Like they have Google Java format.
Yes, I've noticed
all their
that.
code looks the same. Whether or not that's a good thing, that's the way they are. That is not what Netflix looked like. It was the opposite of that. It was all over the place. And I think that as we were interacting with more and more of these, large enterprises, intentionally or not, the large enterprises look more like Netflix than they look like Google. They may want to be very consistent, but they've got 20 years of layer cake archaeology, in their code, and 20,000 engineers spread across every time zone in the world. And if you're going to come in and try to crusade on making it all consistent, you're going to wear out before the 20,000 people wear out. So the foundational technology that refactors needs to be able to accommodate or massage the change to look idiomatically consistent in the context of every repository it's inserting change into. And these are all just very difficult problems that took honestly years to get right.
So with your guys' tool, you need to understand the current coding style of the file that you're in, and match it.
That's right.
Not say, well, you have to follow.
That's right.
One of 3 styles that we support. Wow, that's something else.
So the refactoring technology, the open source refactoring technology, is called Open Rewrite, and one of the foundational principles of Open Rewrite is preserving the style of the original project, and deriving the predominant style from the repository and making changes. The changes will be massaged to look like the project around it. So you can run the same recipe, which recipe is like a unit of transformation that could be as simple as changing a method or as big as Java 8 to 17 or something like that. those are going to look, the change is going to look a little different in every project depending on its predominant style.
Have you found that you can make big jumps like that, or do you have to go through intermediate progressions? Because you know how that works, right? I
I do.
mean, APIs change over time. Do I have to
Right.
do the change multiple times, or can I make big jumps with your technology?
Technically, again, from a technical level, yes, we can make big jumps. I think what we've done is we've layered recipes. The recipes can be kind of long lists of individual recipes and steps. So I think about the Spring Boot 3 migration recipe right now has about 1,800 steps in it. I mean, just all the individual little
Wow,
things that they've changed. And there's still things we don't cover. But, you whether people want to do that all at once, that's the social element of this again. Sometimes it's easier just if you just do JUnit 4 to 5, which is one of the steps inside of this, big
massive recipe.
mass. Um, Maybe we'll just do that first because we could remain on Spring Boot 2 and move to JUnit 5, which is just less change than when we eventually do move to, or maybe I do the Java 8 to 17 thing first, then I do the framework change second. And so, teams, I would say the risk appetite uh, is different everywhere, and to the extent that folks have a greater risk or a less risk appetite, they'll break it down into smaller chunks and do it one piece at a time.
Have I mean, with tools like this, can I move from one language to another as well? Um,
It,
is that even feasible, or
it's an interesting question. Yeah, I think in general we try to say wherever you could, list out a series of steps. If I see this, it looks like this. If I see this, it looks like that. Then it's pretty automatable. I don't really personally believe in like a COBOL to Java, like the COBOL to Spring Boot migration kind of thing. I know there's some companies forming now that purport to do
well, they
this
have
with
to. All the
large
COBOL
language
programmers
models.
are dying,
They are,
right? I mean, I hate
yeah,
to sound like doomsday, but it's
we
true. I
know
mean,
it. We
they
know
don't
it.
even teach COBOL in college anymore, right?
I know. I know. I mean, the desire for it doesn't necessarily make it more tractable. They're just very different, systems.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
don't know that the Java you'd get would be something you'd be happy with. Um,
So let's
but
talk a
then,
little bit about
where's the boundary then? So what I have seen
yeah.
is like EJB, like J2E application to Spring Beans, like that I feel like is more plannable. So where this boundary is, there's a bit of a gray area there, I think.
Got it. Let's talk a little bit about the recipes themselves. You guys build these recipes up for the most popular, I'm
Yeah,
migrations that are out there.
yeah,
I assume, but you also provide a way that you can build your own
absolutely.
recipes. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So in general, there's two pieces to open rewrite. There's the lossless semantic tree, which is like, think of like an abstract syntax tree, but everything the compiler knows about those types too, because if you're going to change a particular method, you need to prove that it comes from a particular type. Otherwise, there's false positive
Right.
potential. The LST also has the formatting of the original code. So this rich data structure. So you've got data on one side, and then recipes are programs that manipulate that tree that eventually gets printed back out to text to produce the change. We do write some. I think Open Rewrite, one of the big incentives for us to make Open Rewrite Apache licensed, it's a bit controversial, is that we just recognize that the surface area of change is very large. It's all of open source and third party code. And so the framework author that's making the breaking change should be the one shouldering the responsibility for providing a recipe that fixes their downstream consumers. So it's kind of like we want a world where it's, if you break it, you fix it. If you're that
I
Spring Team
like that.
author that makes a breaking change, it's your responsibility to provide a recipe to fix your downstream consumers. And if you don't, and one of your competing frameworks, say the Micronaut team for the last 3 years has provided a recipe for every breaking change they've made from Oracle. Well, as a downstream consumer, I consider that to be a decision criteria, like why I would choose Micronaut over Spring. because my upgrade path is assured. Um, so it's,
So
I can't force it,
that's
but
yeah. That's a really interesting competitive advantage then.
it is.
If I'm a software vendor, right?
Right.
I can guarantee
That's right.
as best as I can a tool for migrating from one API to
Right.
a version to another one seamlessly for you using open rewrite. That's pretty
Absolutely.
slick.
And I can even, if as a vendor, I think I can use it as a expansion lever as well. Like suppose I were to create another APM solution right now, and I need to convert a bunch of Datadog specific calls to my new thing, right? I might want to write that recipe because, I'm going to
Oh,
expand
that's
much
it.
more
See,
quickly inside an organization, right?
that's an interesting one too. I could write one for my competitor to
That's right.
migrate to my stuff.
That's right.
That's,
That's right.
hey, all's fair in love and war and software engineering, right?
And so we've seen that happen with Red Hat a bit, writing recipes to move Spring Boot apps to Quarkus. Like, it's a bit spicy, but I think, it makes
No,
sense
it's
that
fair. Yeah.
it's fair.
No, that's fair. So here, how hard is it to create these recipes? Is it pretty time consuming? I would think. I mean, you've got to understand quite a bit about both sides of where you're going from to where you're going to.
So this is the framework itself evolves through like good old fashioned encapsulation, where some of the kinds of changes are very similar. Like I need to change a method name from something to something else. And so we will produce recipes like change method name that has options, which the target method
So,
and the
all right. So
new name.
you've created some higher level
That's right.
abstraction, so I could easily do
Upgrading
things. That
dependencies,
makes
changing
sense.
properties, and so the encapsulation level kind of keeps moving up, as time progresses. Um, One of those, and this kind of crosses communities as well. So, for example, if the JUnit author takes responsibility and provides a recipe to move from JUnit 4 to 5, well, then it's easier then for the Spring team to provide a recipe to move from Spring Boot 2 to 3 because that part of their ecosystem is handled by someone
It's
upstream
already
of
there.
them.
So you have aggregation
That's
as
right.
well, then, which is pretty
That's right.
cool,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
That's super cool. What? My brain already went right to Gen AI
Mm,
because I'm thinking, wait, couldn't I automatically generate a recipe by saying, given something
yeah.
that looks like this, I want it to now look like
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
and do all the fuzzy stuff in
Yeah.
between because I'm a software engineer. I'm lazy by nature, right? I don't want to do things I don't
Yeah.
have to do. So, have you guys delved into that at all on using generative AI to generate
Well, this is
recipes?
where it gets, yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think I remember being at a healthcare company, several months ago, and they were trying to do a struts 2.5 to 6 migration. But once they, how it is,
Oh
and
yeah,
we went to the markdown release notes of struts 2.5 and just pasted those release notes into a file in our IDE, and Copilot, GitHub Copilot was basically like writing out the open rewrite recipes that would accomplish each of these steps.
just that's slick. That is
Now there was a
slick.
ton of hallucination there, right? Like, I mean, it would get types wrong sometimes and whatnot. But basically, what I was looking at is I was looking at a plan. A lot of that had been generated, and I could just modify these things. I think of this as like when you want to do a large scale refactoring, you want like a machine, like a low, like a Lean Six Sigma, like high predictability, low degree of variability machine that can stamp out this change. Gen AI can be used to help produce that machine. And then once you have
Yeah.
it, you kind of deploy it at large scale to make changes to potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of files. Um,
Do you ever see? I mean, those change. You got to test a lot before you go through, and you've got to have a way
yeah,
of making sure that because if you're talking hundreds of thousands of
right,
files, you're never going to know what all of the different things are.
right. I think that's
So
why it's
you really got
important.
to put this in a dev sec. ops and test and all that,
It's one
right?
of the reasons it's very important that Gen AI doesn't directly make the change in those tens or hundreds of thousands of files, because each one of those
That you create that
that's
engine. That
each
makes
one of
sense.
those is subject to low percentage hallucination, even in the best case. So I think about, there was one banking application that we moved from Java 8 to 17. It touched 19,000 files in that repository. Now those changes were provably accurate, so it's not like I had to look at every single one of those 19,000 files in review. The review itself wouldn't scale to the human in the loop in that case, um, but yeah, I mean, I think suppose a recipe does change, like touch 19,000 files, and there's a bug in the recipe, and it fails to compile or fails to produce, or the test fail or something is wrong. It's recipe is a program. It's like we see it as a bug in the program. We fix the bug.
Yeah.
You run it again. It's not like I had to go manually touch every one of those files again. So that tends to be the cycle.
So do you go back to the original file and run it again, or
Exactly.
do you try and build off of the one that was generated appropriately?
It's one of those, if you see something's wrong, you just kind of discard that branch and go, alter the recipe and
And
run it
go
again.
for it.
And so you get kind of progressively closer to the outcome that you want as you go along.
It's very
Yeah,
iterative, it
it
sounds like,
is.
because I mean, you can't, because humans wrote a lot of this code, you can't predict everything a human was going to
Right,
do, right?
right. So as a company, I think, so Open rewrites this recipe. What Moderene is doing is, I think the key thing that we guard is the ability to serialize that LST to disk across, tens or hundreds of thousands of repositories, so that when you're writing a recipe, we can basically pre-run it on all those LSTs, and you get to see, like, oh, I didn't think about this pattern, I didn't think about that pattern, because real
So,
life
so
code
you
is,
guys created a tool to help with that
yeah,
iterative. I'm eventually going to get to it through giving feedback to the engineer
right.
to help make that
Yeah, if I
decision.
produce a recipe thinking I know what all the variability looks like, and I try to distribute it, I'm going to get a lot of individual feedback that it didn't do this right, didn't do that right. So
Oh
you kind of
yeah.
want to be able to, like, pre-test it on the whole code base before distributing it.
This is very cool stuff. If they want to find out more, they go to
That's
Moderna.io,
right.
right?
Yeah, Moderene.io. Yep.
So, Jonathan, it's been great talking to you. I love geeking out with other software engineers, especially a violinist. I mean, do you still pick it up? Do you still pick up your
I
violin?
I started again after leaving the army eventually, although I transitioned to electric and picked up a little bit of jazz, and so a little bit different than it was when before. But
Well,
yeah,
that's awesome, man. That's really awesome. Thanks again for coming on the show. I really
yeah.
appreciate it.
Thanks, Darren.
Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and embrace the digital revolution.